After a few greets with the people of the village who were glad to see Delius back, he quickly found himself escaping towards the outskirts of the village, beyond the public view, as there was something that he wanted to test. As he stepped out of the village, finding a nice secluded spot, Delius took one last look at his surroundings, making sure that he was alone. There was something that he had been dying to find out since he first established traveling to the outer worlds and beginning to perceive time differently. Delius took a deep breath, beginning to absorb the movement of all of the world around him. He was, for the first time, relaxed in his own natural environment, the natural flow of time that he grew up with, no longer feeling the stress of having to focus, control every movement, every action, every breath, down to the most minute of details. But now, he wished to bring a slice of that back, as he slowly opened his eyes from his calming breath. He looked out at the world around him, beginning to focus, to try to slow things down, or more precisely, speed his perception up. And as Delius began to focus, truly enough, the world around him began to slow down, the shifting of leaves in the breeze beginning to slow ever so gently, until the world seemed as if it were standing still, and then locking his perceptions in as he began to look about, trying to turn his head and move and see how it felt. His perceptions were now countless times faster than the environment and the world around him, a flow of time. But how would this affect his body, he thought, as he began to try to move about. And as he did, Delius found something very interesting. Perceptually, he was running at a much higher frame of speed than the world around him, and in the outside world, this allowed him to move with tremendous speed. But as Delius began to try to move within this faster frame rate of time, there was a dramatic difference between this world and the outside one. As he tried to move, he found it difficult to do so, at least at the rate of speed that he would be able to move. Whilst on one of the outer worlds, his body felt sluggish. Every move felt as if it had a great amount of pressure behind it, far more resistance to everything, and thus his body could not move at the speed that it could on the outside. Delius could of course increase his speed, but it took a great measure of force to do so. He began with trying to practice his martial arts in this accelerated state, but found it exceptionally difficult, the moves taking so much longer to come to their finish, their fruition. Trying to move at this rate of speed, it felt as if his body was weighted, as if the air itself slowed his movement, like trying to move in mud, like he was simply bathed in some sort of thick goop that simply prohibited rapid or speedy movements. But forcing his body as hard as he could, Delius could manage a somewhat closer to natural form of movement. It still wasn't anywhere near as fast as he could move while out on the surface world, but when pressing hard enough, his movements almost became comparative to that of a normal person as he began to force his way through the motions of his martial arts, practicing the techniques. As he did, there was a very strange sensation, as he had grown far more attentive to being able to absorb vast details. He began to notice that the trees around him were beginning to move as he forced his way through his martial arts stances. Their shifts didn't seem normal, but for the moment, Delius began to ignore it, trying to get all the way through his set of martial arts stances and motions, one after another, completing them as fast as he possibly could. As he finally began to near the end of this set of motions, one specific motion brought him in a roundabout, facing back towards the village. And there he saw one of the village warriors, who seemed to be quite close by, most likely having come up during Delius's martial arts practice. He of course looked as if he were moving in slow motion compared to Delius, and the way he was perceiving the world. But the most interesting thing about it was, he seemed to be on guard. He was raising his arm as if he were trying to fend something off, and his hair looked as if it were blowing in some sort of breeze, as behind him he could see approaching two other village warriors who looked like they were in a bit of a frantic rush, despite the fact that they appeared to be moving in slow motion. So, in the moment, Delius decided that at this point they had probably stumbled upon him, and decided that it would be best to cease for the time being, bringing his martial arts stances to an end, and finally beginning to reacquaint himself, refocus back to his original frame of time. And as he did, something that did not feel apparent while he was in the accelerated flow of time suddenly began to jump out at him, as if it should have been obvious. The wind that seemed to be whipping in the trees was extraordinarily intense, but it wasn't coming from one direction or another. It seemed to be focused on the location where he was performing his stances, rushing out from where he was, and the more time began to speed up or slow down depending on how you want to perceive it, and the warriors became aligned with his perception of time, beginning to appear to move normally. All of them looked shocked as they approached, wind rushing past them, as they finally came to a stop, now moving at a normal rate of speed as the wind was dying down. "What in the world is going on?" they shouted. "Delius?" they said, as they seemed to just only now notice him, as if he just appeared from nowhere. "What was that, Delius? The entire village is in an uproar over it." "What?" Delius replied. "What are you talking about? You're telling me that you didn't hear all of that racket? The bursts, they sounded like explosions, like fighting. And then the air, it was suddenly as if a storm were passing through." "No, I didn't notice it," Delius said, as he began to look down at his hands. And as he did, he began to note that there seemed to be steam rising from his body. He suddenly felt very tired and was sweating a great deal, as if he had gone through a very extreme series of exercises, even though it only took a short time. The sweat itself actually beginning to evaporate from his body, creating a steam that gently floated off of him as he breathed heavily, not realizing how exhausted he suddenly felt. "Delius, are you okay?" Yes, Delius replied. I was doing a bit of a workout, that's all." "Well, what kind of workout would do that?" the guards replied, looking between each other. "Delius, did something happen while you were off-world? Did you gain some sort of new power?" they asked him, as Delius stood, still breathing heavily as he stared at his hand, the wafts of steam drifting from his form. "Well, I think so. It appears there are some advantages once you make it home from the outside world. But It appears the cost of trying to use them might be higher than I expected. Regardless, it's interesting, Delia said as he began to walk past the village guard, heading back towards the center of town, as they all stared at him in amazement. Tell the people of the village not to worry. Tell them I got a little rambunctious with my training, and that it's nothing to concern themselves with, Delia said as he left the guards behind him.